So I know that this class is going to be jam-packed with great information, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to Nature Photography. My name is Kristen Barker. I'm the Community Education Coordinator here at the Garden, and I'm very happy to be joined by Keir Morse, who I will be handing you over to in just a minute here. But before I do, I just want to kind of go over the format of the class. If you've taken classes with us in the past, you're pretty familiar with this, but for our new friends, I just wanted to let you know how it kind of works. So throughout the class, I hope and encourage you all to use the Q&A feature if you have any questions. Like I mentioned, this class is going to have a lot of great information. So we're going to have a time kind of halfway through where we'll be able to address some of your questions, and then we'll have a more dedicated time at the end to have more thoroughly go over those questions as well. So please use the Q&A throughout, and we'll be able to address those as we can. And then also encourage everyone to use the chat. We kind of got it started as we were waiting for everyone to log on, but a great way to kind of connect with your classmates is to kind of check in with each other in the chat. And so if you want to connect with each other, I would suggest that in your chat bar, there's a blue bar, a drop down, where you can switch from all panelists to all panelists and attendees. And that way you'll be connecting with each other and not just Keir and myself. Also, we are recording this, so it'll be up on the digital content page of our website, which is calbg.org. If not by the end of the day today, definitely by the end of the day on Monday. And it's a great way to kind of get some, if you want to go back and refresh before you go out and shoot next time, you'll have that available to you as well. And lastly, you should have received an email from me that had a kind of a handout from Keir, which summarized basically what he's going to go over in the class today. And so that will be a great place to kind of follow along and, maybe write in some additional notes if you want to. And also I'll be sending a follow-up email after the class with any additional resources or references that Keir might mention throughout the class. So don't worry if you don't write everything down 100%, you'll have that information from me in an email after the class as well. So that's about it for me. So I'm going to hand you over to Keir. Keir Morse is a PhD student here through the Claremont Graduate University here at CalBG. He's also an avid photographer. If you visit websites like iNaturalist or CalFlora or CalScape, you'll see he has a photo credit on a lot of those photos. So he's out all the time taking thousands of photos of the flora and fauna of California. So he's a great person to kind of lead us through this conversation today, and I hope you all enjoy it. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Keir. Keir, thanks for being here today.
Hello, everybody. So yeah, Keir Morse. Thought I'd start by just giving you a little bit of background of where I got into photography. I essentially started photography in college the first time around about 20-something years ago while I was studying biology. So I got into botany and photography at the same time. And a lot of the photography I've done has essentially been to document the stuff that I'm seeing and particularly post things online. So people that are plants and stuff that there aren't photos for online, trying to fill in that information. So yeah, that's a big goal of my photography. And how does this work? I did something and now I have no control. Uh-oh. Let's see, maybe this will work. No, we'll see what happens there. All right. Should have maybe tried this a little bit better first. Okay, so now I got another panel on the way. All kinds of panels are popping up. All right, anyway, so topics to be addressed. We're gonna kind of split this into two sessions, as she mentioned. The first half is going to focus on image file settings, basic camera modes, and then aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, which go hand in hand with those basic camera modes. We'll break for questions, focusing on that stuff. After that, we'll be going into getting the right exposure, some tips on focus, and then some various other tips, and then go into the rest of the question periods. Apparently, I have to, there's definitely something going wrong in here. Show video plan. The slide forward buttons are certainly not working. Okay, maybe I'll stop share and reshare.
That sounds good.
Okay, how to share screen? Share. All right, we'll see how that works now. Okay. It's like my arrow keys have been disabled. There is a little arrow in the button. Okay, we'll see what happens.
All right, that's great.
Worked before.
Yeah, technical difficulties, but we're there now.
All right. So we're going to start with the file image settings. So in the past, a lot of times when people have asked me questions about why their particular photos are not so good, it usually really comes down to the file image settings. So that's a good starting point. So when you are taking photos, to know to set up your camera properly. So the first setting is essentially the resolution of your image. So if you have a high resolution, a larger image, an example on the left, you're going to have a lot more detail. On the far right, this is what happens when you use a smaller image size. So for that same image, you're essentially pixelating it, you're losing a lot of detail. So that's fine if you're just going to throw it on a website or something. But if you actually want to do anything with the photos, like print them or zoom in and crop in a closer area, see some of that detail, you're losing that if you shoot with a smaller image size. So I definitely recommend using the highest image size you can. Let me print out scenario. Another setting is the compression. So if you're shooting in JPEG mode, JPEGs compress the photos. So by using the minimal compression, you get the best image possible. And you can see that on the left. On the right, depending on your monitor, you might not see a whole lot of differences here, but you'll start getting kind of this squared sort of artifact in the image that is kind of problematic. If we look closer in here, so this is zoomed much further in. On the left side, you can see it looks a little bit on the blurry side, but that's just because we're zoomed all the way in. But it's a relatively smooth textures. As you get over to the right side in the high compression, you see all these kind of big squares, and this is where it's used some sort of algorithms and stuff to shrink the image down. It's essentially throwing away information. So again, if you really want to do something with these photos, zoom in close or print them in larger format, you want to use the minimal amount of compression. One thing I'm not going to get into a whole lot, I don't have any examples here, but there's a video on the PDF document that I've linked to if you want to learn more, is JPEG versus RAW. RAW files are essentially exactly the image your camera takes without any processing. No data is lost. So it's kind of the equivalent of the film negative. So that's a really cool thing to have, but they're a lot more work. So if you want to put a lot of extra time into it, something to think about. JPEG is just, it's a smaller file. Has a little more compression. Your camera's already applied a bunch of settings to it. So it is what it is, but it's a lot less work. And you can also shoot JPEG plus RAW, which gives you both choices if you decide you want to do more processing later on the same image. So cool to have those options. So going into the basic camera modes, depending on your camera, you may or may not have all these modes, but most cameras usually have at least the program mode, maybe the aperture and shutter priority, and a lot of them do have manual as well. But you usually have a dial, as you see on the left, that will have these letters on it. So we'll start with aperture priority mode. So aperture priority mode, essentially you set the aperture, you choose the aperture, and then your camera figures out the other settings for you. So first of all, what is aperture? An aperture is essentially the amount of light that's being let into the camera. So if you look at these black circles on the left side where my mouse is, we have the f2.8. So that black part is essentially where no light's coming in, and the white hole in the center is that's how large your opening is for the light to come in and hit the sensor. On the right side where it says F16, this is your f-stop or your aperture is closed down, and that hole in the center is much, much smaller. So you got a lot less light coming in. And what this affects is depth of field. And depth of field is essentially kind of how much is in focus. So if you look at this particular photo, you got this kind of cool little weird fern in the center, but in front of you, it's all blurry. And then behind the fern, it's all blurry. So aperture essentially controls how big this window is and how much of is in focus versus how much is blurred. So this is useful for when you're trying to get those kind of blurry effects behind an image. So this is an example of the same picture taken with several different f-stops. On the upper left, the f3.5, you can see in the center, I focused just on a bit of the leaf, and a lot of the background is kind of blurred out. And as you increase the number on the f-stop, you're reducing the amount of light, but you're getting more and more in focus. So by f22 on the bottom right, you can see that everything is in focus. So this is just a kind of cool way you can control how much it is in focus on the camera. So why do you want to use aperture priority mode? As we just showed, you want less in focus. So you may want to do this for an artistic effect or to remove distractions. I'll show you some examples of that. You may also want more in focus. If you're shooting macro, the closer you get into your subject, the smaller that depth of field is. So it's a lot harder to get things in focus, and you may not be able to get as much in focus as you want to. And then third, you just may want to take a bunch of pictures with the same f-stop, and there could be various reasons for doing that, and just whatever makes you happy. So here's a good example of trying to remove the distraction in the background. On the left side, you can see I've used a low f-stop number. So I blurred out the background, and you can even see that some of the subject plant that I want to focus on is a little bit blurry. So you can use a more intermediate one, like in the middle, that's giving a little more of the subject plant in focus, but then you get a little bit more distraction in the background. And then on the right, you can see how by blurring that background in the first image, it really did help the plant stand out. So different photos, it may be better to do one thing or another, but it's good to have this option, and this is how you do it. Here's another example of a plant where I've blurred the background and actually part of the leaves and stuff on the bottom one at f1.9, and then in the top, you can see there's a lot more in focus at the background. And from a diagnostic standpoint, probably something in the middle might have been a little bit better to blur some of the background, but I blurred out the leaves on this one, and it might have been nice to have those leaves in focus. As I mentioned, as you get closer in to a subject, so your lens is very close to the thing you're photographing, you lose the amount of depth of field. There's a lot less that can be in focus. So on the left two here, these are both the same setting. This is f3.2. I've got a little bit of the body in focus on one and the face in focus on another, which, ideally maybe I want more in focus. So bringing that up to f7.1, I got, again, a little bit more in focus. And then bringing it up again to f22, I got as much as I can get in focus. And remember, we changed this based on the amount of light that's coming through. So on the f3.2, it's wide open, it's a bigger hole, there's a lot more light coming in. On the far right, f22, I'm trying to get more in focus, but it's a much smaller hole. So there's a lot less light coming in. And in this particular case, it wasn't bright enough. I had to add flash to actually take this picture because I needed more light. So back to this image. So we talked about that depth of field, and a low depth of field, you get that by having a low f-stop number or being very close to the subject. but also a longer lens can do this, and a larger sensor size. So even though you control this with the aperture and the f-stop, depending on your camera, the sensor size and all that, you may or may not be able to get very much blurred if that's your goal. Generally, a larger sensor size, larger cameras are really good for getting that blur, but it can also be problematic if you're trying to not have that. This is kind of counterintuitive, and it took me a long time to get this figured out in my brain, but so this is a $20 bill that we're like really, really close to. And as we talked about on the f5 end, we should have the least amount in focus, so the smallest depth of field, and on the right side, we should have the most amount in focus and the greatest depth of field. So the reality here is everything is in focus in this particular one, but you essentially, on the f5 end, you have that larger opening, so the light's just coming straight in, and you're getting a much crisper image. Because on f22 you have a much smaller hole, there's something about the way the light bends and stuff that you get more in focus, but it's a very soft focus. It's not as good of a focus. So there's trade-offs there. So while there may be more in focus, it's not a very good focus. So different reasons you may or may not want to use that. So zooming close in, if you want to crop, then f22 is maybe not so good. But if you're looking at just the full image in a smaller thing and get more in focus, that could be great. So shutter priority mode, essentially here we are choosing the shutter speed. And then your camera figures out the other settings for you. So here's an example of some different shutter speeds on, this is a gooseberry plant that is moving really fast in the wind. So at the upper left, we have 1/100th of a second. So that's a relatively slow exposure, at least with this wind going on. And you can see it's blurry. So we got motion blur because that wasn't fast enough to freeze it. As you increase the shutter speed, at the bottom right, we got 1/1000th of a second. This is 10 times faster than that first one. And that shutter speed's so fast that with that movement, it can freeze it. You can also see, as we just talked about with the aperture, and the 1/1000th of a second one, we got more of a blurry background, and that's an f6.3. As you get to the 1/100th of a second one, the f20, that's got a lot more texture going on in the background, so it's not so blurred. And the thing to really think about here, so remember the f20, that's one that has a smaller hole, so less light's coming in, so you need more light, so you need a longer exposure, so that's why it's it's 1/100th of a second, and vice versa. If you have more light coming in with the f6.3, then 1/1000th of a second is a lot, essentially allowing less light in there. So you're balancing out your light with these various settings. So why do you want to use shutter priority mode? First, as we just showed, you may want to freeze motion, get a faster exposure. And then the other thing is maybe you want to show motion. So you'll have a slower exposure and show maybe motion blur or just how things have changed over time. So one reason I use the shutter priority mode a lot is if you're in a darker condition, you can only hold the camera steady so much with your hands. You'll shake it a bit. So a lot of times I will set it to 1/125th of a second because I know I can hold it steady at that. So this is taken in a dark canyon, and so I would set it at that, and I just to make sure that the camera doesn't decide that, well, I can actually hold it steady at a speed that I actually couldn't hold it steady. So it's a good way to prevent having a blurry image in a darker situation. So for freezing motion, you want a really fast exposure. You can see here this moth is coming in to pollinate this flower, and I've managed to freeze the proboscis as the proboscis is unfurling to go into that flower and nectar in there. So that's pretty cool. But notice the wings are blurry. These wings were going so fast that even 1/2000th of a second wasn't fast enough to stop them. And here on the opposite end, this photo is, the shutter speed is 10 times longer than the previous photo. So I'm showing motion here. The wings of that bee are going pretty darn fast, and so I'm kind of capturing that motion with this picture by choosing to have a slower exposure. Program mode. So this mode is essentially auto mode, except for it gives you some more options. So I would never shoot in auto mode. I would almost always shoot in program mode. It's really easy, but yeah, there are these little different things you can do. And some cameras have what's called program shift. So when you're shooting program mode, your camera decides what all the settings are for you, but usually you can just turn a dial and essentially shift the settings one way or another if for whatever reason you want to do that. And then manual mode, essentially you're choosing both the aperture and the shutter speed yourself. So this is for when essentially your camera is not doing what you want it to be doing. It's trying to, it doesn't know exactly what you're thinking. So it takes its best guess and maybe it's wrong. Also, you just may want to do something fun and different, and could be interesting. So this is a good example. This is where I mostly use the manual mode. This is an example of a photo that's actually taken in daylight, but I've combined a very fast exposure, so that's reducing the amount of light that's coming in. The f-stop is relatively high, so that, again, reducing the amount that's coming in, and then I'm adding a flash to increase the amount of light on the subject. So just it's a very fast exposure with a lot of light in just one little area, and then all the background doesn't actually get that light because I'm focusing all the light on the subject. So this is a sort of thing you can do with your manual settings because your camera would not be able to guess that you could do this. And here's another example where I just was fooling around. I wanted to see what sort of things I could do with motion and flash. So again, your camera is not going to be able to guess what you're doing. So you just try a bunch of different things in different settings and see what happens. And usually when you're doing this, you take a lot of different photos and you keep changing the settings and just see what you get. But a great use for manual mode, because again, your camera's never going to be able to guess that this is what you're trying to do. So I've mentioned the word exposure a few times. And this is essentially the amount of light that is hitting your sensor or the film. And this affects how dark or light parts of your photo are. This is annoying because there's a panel on top of what I was going to say. But so your exposure is essentially made by the aperture plus the shutter speed. So we talked about those two, and then the ISO, the sensitivity, which we'll get to. So this exposure triangle is in your PDF document, but essentially it's a great way to kind of see how these three things combine together to create your set exposure. So you have your exposure is the amount of light essentially that's hitting the sensor. But yeah, so how this works essentially, so again, with the aperture, you either have, if you have it, I'll say the f32 end here, it's a smaller hole, so there's a lot less light coming in through that hole. So you essentially need more light to change. I'm screwing this all up. Yeah. So yeah, essentially it comes down to the amount of light you're trying to get for your exposure. So you need more light if you have a small hole in your aperture. You need less light if your aperture is giving you a lot of light if you're on the f1 end. So you will need less light from the other settings. The same thing applies here. So if you have a very fast shutter speed, that's making it so there's not a lot of light. So you need more light from your other settings. And then again, the slower shutter speed, that's giving you a lot of light. So you need a lot less light from the other settings to make it all balance out. ISO, I haven't talked about yet. So this essentially is it's not actually changing the amount of light that comes in, but the sensitivity of either your film or the sensor of the camera. So If you're at the lower end, 100, that means it's less sensitive, so you need more light to get that exposure. If it's on the other end, you're shooting with a really high sensitivity, and then it needs less light. So this is a good example of ISO. So these photos were all taken kind of in a shadier area. So a lot of times when you're increasing your ISO, it's because it's dark out and you want to be able to capture something without blur that you might not be able to do otherwise. So at the ISO 200, you'll note that the shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. But if you get up to the crazy ISO 25,600, we're shooting at a speed of 1/4000th of a second. So it's a really, really fast shutter speed. And that's because we've changed the sensitivity, what it needs. But you're making a sacrifice with that higher ISO. And you can kind of see it in this photo. It's not so bad because it's shrunk down so much. But on the ISO 2560, or whatever the big ass number is, on the bottom right, you can see it's kind of grainy in the background compared to the other ones. And we'll zoom in on that. And in this particular case, particularly the background behind the flower, you can really see all this texture, which is just generally a lot of information is lost. It's just a really kind of poor photo. So that's a sacrifice there compared to the other ones. If you look in the background of each of them, as you get to that lower ISO number, it becomes smoother. So the only reason you would generally go to something, an ISO that's as high as the bottom right one, is it's really low light and you're not going to be able to get this picture otherwise. And, you know, it's a cool picture. It's like some jaguar running through town or something. I don't know. But you really want to get that picture. So that lets you take it, even though it's not going to be as good as it would be. Worth really looking at here. So the top two, you'll notice that the flower on the upper left is blurry. Even though that the ISO is better, so it's a smoother background. Because I used that lower ISO, I had to use a longer shutter speed, and there was a bit of wind blowing, so I got motion blur in there. So that's not good. So this is a great example where you may want to increase your ISO up to something a little bit faster, so you could take a faster shutter speed as the one on the right. So I'm not sacrificing a huge amount. I don't have a lot more noise, but a little bit more noise, but it's in focus. So yeah, so you just kind of balance all these things out. There's costs and benefits to each setting. So looking back at this exposure triangle, as I said, these three things balance out and actually give you your exposure, which is the set amount of light or whatever that is making the photo. So if you're shooting in an auto or program mode, it's going to pick for you through the three settings. So assuming none of those are locked, this is an example of what we might get. It's choosing to give us these three particular settings for this exposure. Now, if we're going into a mode where we lock the ISO, we know we only want to have a 200 for our ISO. If you want to change either the aperture or shutter speed, you have to change the other one. So because there's less light for each of these, or less or more light, you have to make up for that with the other one. So all these triangles you see inside the larger triangle are the exact same exposure, but they're different settings to get that exposure. So it does show you there's a lot of things you can do with a particular exposure and get different things that you can use in different situations to get that same exposure. And similarly, if we did the same thing, locking the aperture, we have all these options. And if we lock the shutter speed, we have these options, all giving us the exact same exposure. So yeah, there we go. Questions?
All right. Yeah. So if you have any questions at this time, this is a nice time to kind of come in and see if there was anything you wanted some clarity on, or you can put those into the Q&A. And we can pause for a second and see if we get any questions, but if not, we can kind of continue on.
Let's see if I can figure out how to hide this stupid panel.
All right, so Keir, are you going to be talking about lenses and how much that might make a difference going forward?
Not a whole lot, but yeah, so essentially, as I mentioned with the aperture, that's where you get kind of you can get the blurry stuff, but different lenses may be able to do different apertures. So like they talk about having fast lenses. That's one that actually can open up a lot and let in a lot of light, and they're really good for taking fast photos and for getting that blurred background. And other lenses can do various other things, but that's why a lot of people, when they have the cameras that have interchangeable lenses, you can have all these different sort of things. And also worth knowing, different lenses have different capabilities. So if you want f/22, a lot of lenses maybe only go up to f/8. If you want f/1.6 going down, maybe a lot of lenses can only go down to f/4. So there's a lot to think about with those sort of lenses. I mostly shoot with point and shoots at this point, so I don't have a huge amount of choice for what I'm doing, but yeah.
Do you know of like a good all-purpose lens?
Not specifically. The big thing with all-purpose lenses is there may be an optimum sort of thing somewhere in there, but you're sacrificing something. That's a lot of the professionals will have a bunch of different lenses for different situations. But I would just look into a lot of reviews and stuff. I don't use it very much now, but my micro 4/3 camera, that's one with interchangeable lenses. It's got a macro lens that is supposedly really good for portraits, and has a decent zoom and stuff like that. But yeah, there's the big thing is whatever you choose, you're sacrificing something else. Is the big thing.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think we can, unless there's any other questions, we can kind of move on.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. So I just talked about exposure. So then how do you get the correct exposure? So one of the big things we got here is metering. So metering essentially is how your camera measures the amount of light this and tries to decide what your exposure is going to be. So there's kind of three basic types of metering where essentially they assess different amounts of what you're looking at. So with the spot metering, you can see with that red circle, it's only looking at a very small amount and assessing that small area. With the center weighted, which is what I normally use, it's assessing a larger area, but not the full thing. And then with a matrix or evaluative, it may assess the entire image. And where this can be problematic is in the amount of black or white that's in a particular photo. So your meter in general is trying to find more kind of medium values. It's trying not to overexpose or underexpose. So in the case of the one on the right, there's a lot of black there. So if your goal is to try to get that metered on the white, and you only have that smaller amount of white, you want that white exposed properly. Having all that black can kind of make that difficult for your camera to figure out. So an example of that, if we were to use this spot metering, so you're just metering on a little tiny area on the left where it says good exposure, it's metering on kind of a little bit of dark and a little bit of light. So it's trying to find that balance between them, and it's getting a good exposure from that. In the middle one, it's focusing just on that white area. So essentially the camera is thinking that that's more of a gray area. So it's underexposing that to try to make it more gray. And then on the right side, it's looking at that black area. And because it's focusing on that black area and trying to think, well, that the medium of that should be maybe more gray, it's changing that to more of a gray. And then your flower is getting way overexposed because it's making it much brighter. So depending what you want to be a certain brightness, that's where metering can be useful in changing the particular type of metering you're using. So histograms are something a lot of cameras have to kind of give you an idea of whether something is underexposed or overexposed, or just the amount of black and white in a particular photo. So you can see in the middle photo on the histogram below, it's not cut off on either end. So this is, so on one end of this histogram is blacks and on the other end is whites. So if we look over on the left side, you can see where essentially the histogram has been chopped off and everything on the left side is now black. So that's data that is essentially lost. And then on the right side, it's done the same thing, but it chopped it off on the right for the right photo. And we've essentially lost a lot of values that were close to white. And we'll zoom in on that. So here you can see where the darker shades have been lost. And this is somewhere where if you were shooting raw, you might be able to save some of this. But in the case of a JPEG, right where my mouse is, so we've essentially chopped off this spot right here on the photo over here. So this black area, all that information is gone. And it's not necessarily a bad thing if you want black, but if you want some detail in there, by underexposing that, you've lost that detail. Same thing applies here. This is with arguably an overexposure on the right side. We've chopped off the lighter shades of white, or whatever, if shades of white. You've essentially chopped it off, and you can see that in here. So there's detail in the whites where there's like the little cells you can even see in the petal, and it's just a smooth white in the right photo. So we've essentially chopped that off and thrown away all of that data and just called it all white. So once again, if you're doing that, you're throwing away that data and you're not going to get it back, which again is okay if that's what you want to do. But a lot of times what I'll do is I'll underexpose, particularly the whites, just to try to save some of that detail in there. I might brighten it up later, but I want to save that detail. So I don't really use the histograms. I'm going to try to hide this panel again, see if I can still keep going. Okay, so highlight and shadow clipping is the thing I use instead of the histograms, and it kind of shows you the same thing. So if you look on the one on the right where it's highlighted in red on the photo, that's showing you the same thing on the histogram where it's chopped off. So it's showing you this is pure white, there's no other detail there. And likewise on the left side where it's showing you the blue, that's pure black and there's no other detail there. So this is a great way to be able to see that when you're taking the image. And you look at the top now, I got this plus or minus exposure compensation thing. So this is how I get around this. So a lot of cameras, you'll see a plus or minus button, or there'll be some way you can change the exposure. So by, like I said, a lot of times I'll be shooting photos of a white flower and I'll be able to see that this, I've overexposed the whites here if it's got this red there. So by pressing that plus or minus button, or however your particular camera does it, and then turning a dial, you can essentially lower the exposure so you can underexpose it and then get something more like this. And here you can see that there still is a little bit of red speckled here and there. And then likewise, if you had a photo that you wanted to expose more, you can increase the exposure that way. So so exposure compensation and bracketing, and you can, some cameras will actually do a bracketing option where you can set it up to take a bunch of different exposures. So then when you take these, you just automatically have all these different exposures, and then you can go back later and choose what you want or process them more. And with the exposure compensation button, you can do the same thing. You just have to individually do that. But this is kind of showing the same photo that has different exposures. One thing to think about, particularly with yellow flowers, is I've had a hard time with them. They're really easy to overexpose. And then if you are using the histogram, you can note that it's not chopped off here because this isn't white, this is yellow. But by having this really high value here, this potentially shows you that maybe something's overexposed, or it's just essentially saying there's a whole lot of yellow. But just something to be careful of, and know that yellow flowers can be pretty tricky and easy to overexpose. And again, a lot of times I'll underexpose things just to try to try to get that stuff back later. And again, this may be a good reason to use RAW, which I don't use, maybe should. So another thing, good example, so if something's backlit, your camera can't necessarily choose the correct exposure. There's nothing wrong with the photo on the left side, like it's still kind of a cool photo. But say I really want to identify this bird based on some coloration or something. So I've used the exposure compensation and really made a much longer exposure so I can brighten up the feathers. So then I can see more detail there. So just an option to get multiple different sorts of exposures relatively easy is just to hit that exposure compensation button and just try different things and see what works good for you. So HDR is actually a really cool thing where it does the exposure bracketing and then it stacks these photos together so you can get things a much better exposure. So a good example on this left side here, with this exposure, the foreground of the chaparral is pretty nicely exposed, but you'll see the sky is just really white up here, and you can see in the histogram that we've chopped off all that data. So it's just pure white up there in a lot of the areas. By doing an HDR photo, or you can do this manually as well, by taking a whole bunch of exposures and then stacking them in some program, you got a different photo here that made the sky from this photo here that made this, and there could be as many as 10, who knows how many photos that are put together to kind of create this cool different photo that's an amalgamation of other photos. This is one of my favorite HDR photos I've taken. This is just with an iPhone. But you can see on the left side how, it's very underexposed throughout most of the bottom and it's very overexposed in the top. The camera just tried to find that balance in between and couldn't do it because it was just too bright and too dark and nothing was the exposure the camera wanted. So by stacking all these photos together, it created a much, much better image. And one thing to be wary of is sometimes these images can kind of be, it can be a little overcompensated, and you get kind of gray, muddy photos as well. So they can be cool, but you can get some kind of ugly photos out of them as well. It's worth trying. So focus. So with the focus, there's a lot of options. You'll just have to kind of look at your manual and see what you can do with your particular camera. I usually use the single point autofocus, but it's kind of similar to the metering where you can have your camera thinking about like a larger area or smaller areas. It can focus on faces now, some of them, or track something moving. Lots of options. One of the biggest issues I've had with focusing is using the auto mode on smaller, thinner plants. And in the example on the left side, it's trying to focus on the background where I want it to actually focus on the plant. So here, what I've done in the middle, I use this quite a bit, is I'll put my finger right behind the thing I want in focus, and then you can point the center of the camera where my finger is in this case, and if you hold the button halfway down, that locks both your exposure and your focus, and then you can move the camera back to where you want it, reframe it, and then press the button the rest of the way down, and that takes your photo. So definitely worth knowing is, the finger focusing thing also, but the holding the camera button halfway down. You can point your picture anywhere, hold the button halfway down, and you get your exposure and your focus, and then you can reframe it however you want, which is, very nice if you want to focus on something to the side and then, move it to the side where the center is not what would be in focus. Manual focusing is also another option, which can be very useful, especially when things are being not cooperative. One of my cameras has what's called manual focus assist, where essentially it will zoom in on the particular part in the center, and then you can kind of see what's in focus better, because it's really hard to see what's in focus when you're just looking at a little tiny screen. On the right is a example of focus peaking. So like we saw where it was highlighting before things that were overexposed. In this particular case, it's highlighting what's in focus. So as you change the manual focus, this particular one is highlighted in red. You can because it's hard to see actually what's in focus on your screen. That will kind of give you a way to see that pretty easily. Focus stacking is something that my current point and shoot with the Olympus Tough camera does really well, which is pretty cool. So as we talked before, as you get in closer to your subject, your depth of field is much smaller. It's really hard to get very much in focus. So on the flowers on the left, so the flowers are maybe 2 millimeters across. They're very small. That's all sand below. But you can't get very much in focus there. So kind of like with the HDR, where we stacked a bunch of apertures, here we're taking a whole bunch of pictures at different focus and then stacking those. So it's a really cool way to get stuff in focus with macro mode. And as we mentioned before too, the f/22, we can get more in focus there, but it's not a very good focus. So by using a lower f-stop, that's a crisper focus, even though less is in focus, you can stack a bunch of different focuses together and get a crisper image than you would have if you had taken these more at like f/22. One big thing with stacking of any kind, both focus or the HDR, things move with wind, or maybe you moved when you're taking the pictures. So when you're stacking these photos together, you can get error. So where that arrow is pointing, essentially the wind had blown or something, and we got this kind of ghost image. So stacking only works so good. And this is where maybe sometimes using a manual stacking program, you could actually choose which pictures you want and do that. But I haven't done any of that. I just use what the camera's got and hope for the best. But just know that sometimes if you do the stacking, it might not work, and maybe good to zoom in on your camera if your camera's doing that and check that photo before you move away. Take a second one. And some additional photo tips. So white balance, I don't do a whole lot with white balance. It can get really complicated, but it's worth thinking about. So this is an example where I took a photo of an iris in the shade. You can see I usually just leave it on the auto setting, bottom left. And auto setting is, depending on your monitor, mine it's a little on the blue side. And if you look at the shadow, so by changing the setting to shadow, it's potentially more correct. So if you're in a situation and the lighting may be weird or something, you can change your white balance and correct for things. And as noted at the bottom with the incandescent and fluorescent, like these are definitely useful for indoor sort of things, depending if you want a particular lighting or not. Flash is something I use actually quite a bit. And normally you think of flash as something you use when it's darker out, but it's worth thinking about fill flash. So here this flower on the left side is kind of shading itself, so you can't really see the detail as well in there. Like, is it darker in the center because that's shadow, or is it darker in the center because it's darker in the center? So by using this fill flash, you can actually see the patterns inside the flower much better. And it also lights up this calyx on the left side of the flower too. It's in shadow in the first one. So pretty cool. Something definitely to think about with flash. So this is the camera I'm using if you're doing macro and you're getting really, really close. So I'll be taking photos like the lens will be maybe 1 inch away from the thing. You can see with this blue arrow, the flash is way up here. The lens with the green arrow is down here. The flash is not going to reach something down here if it's that close. So there's these attachments. This is what I have for mine, where essentially the flash gets reflected through a hole and then bounced around the outside of the lens. So it's a cool way to light up macro stuff. And the same thing here. This is for an LED light. So that gives you not as good of an image, but you could potentially use video and stuff on that, whereas the flash is just a quick sort of thing. And you can do homemade sort of things too on these, like make your own out of cardboard and aluminum foil, but just a cool thing to think about. We mentioned before with longer exposures, you can kind of show motion, but also it's worth thinking about a tripod. So say you're doing a longer exposure, you want, in this case, a waterfall sort of thing. You want to see the motion of the water, but you want everything else to be crystal clear. You don't want that moving. So So longer exposure coupled with tripods could be really useful. This is used for like the star trail photos where you're taking a longer exposure as the star moves through the sky, but maybe you want to see the landscape around there not moved, like you want that crystal clear. Big thing to think about, I did this a lot when I was first starting, is I took a lot of photos of just the flowers straight on. There's a whole lot of variety out there, a lot of cool things to look at. So think about that. Take a lot of different photos and move beyond just taking the flower photo if you're one of those sort of people, because it's pretty cool. And kind of in the same vein, if you're doing citizen science or you want to learn more about the organisms you're photographing, get some IDs from people, the more photos you take of things, the better. In particular, this is in a sunflower in the aster family. Taking a photo of the backside of the flower with all these bracts and stuff, that's one of the best things to identify it. And people usually just take a picture of the front of the flower. And then likewise, take pictures of leaves, take pictures of the whole plant. The more different things you can get, the more useful it is to others if they wanted to try to identify it, or yourself if you want to identify it later. Same thing sort of with iNaturalist. If you're doing photography for citizen science and you want to contribute, it's good to know where these photos were taken fairly accurately. Also, say you go on a vacation somewhere and you took this cool photo and you want to know, where was that photo? I don't remember. You can geotag these photos. Some cameras will have their own GPS. One bad thing about that a lot of times is it uses up a lot of the battery for taking the photos. And if your GPS is turning on and off, you're going to get not very good points. So I recommend using a track log on either your phone or another GPS. And when you're out taking pictures, run that track log. Make sure that the GPS phone, whatever you're using, has the exact same date and time as the camera. And then other software later can combine these together. There's some free software if you just search online. I use Adobe Lightroom, which does cost more money, but it works really great. Another thing to really think about is post-processing. Ideally, you want to get your photo as good as you can before, like when you take the photo, so you don't have to do too much post-processing. But I'll do a lot of this, particularly. So the example on the upper left, you can see that this is as close as I could get it. And this flower is a couple millimeters across. So essentially, if I want a good image out of that, I have to zoom in, crop, and then I just did some touching up with sharpening, clarity, some of the colors. But worth thinking about that. There's more to do after a photo if you want that photo to be better as well. And I use Lightroom to do this as well. And one more big thing I will say is read your camera manual. At least glance through it every once in a while. This is something I hopefully do at least once a year, and I almost always find something that I didn't realize my camera did. There's a lot of cool settings that I never use, and I'll often find something of like, oh, I wish I knew about that a year ago in this particular situation. So that's good to do. And then note that your camera manual that you got with your camera is probably just a quick manual. I don't know if they actually put the full manual in any cameras anymore, but they are available online. So go search for your camera manual online and it'll have a lot more detail. And then also related to this, there's a lot of videos online. I've learned some stuff, just search for a video of the camera you use and you might get some cool videos showing you cool things you can do with it. And with that, I guess we're open for questions again.
Thanks, Keir. That was great. Yeah, so if you have any questions, this is a great time to to ask them, and we can address any questions you may have. So you can put them into the chat or into the Q&A, and we can go from there. Okay. So is focus stacking a setting in your camera?
So yeah, it is a setting in the camera that I'm using. Maybe I should go into some sort of mode that, let's see. Can I stop sharing? Stop sharing. And then get rid of, yeah, might as well get rid of my virtual background. So I can pull out my camera here. So this is the camera I use, the Olympus Tough camera. You can see this reflector thing that I got on there that diffuses the flash. But this is the camera that has the focus stacking. I don't know how many cameras do that, but this one does, and it's a very cool feature. I love it. I use it a lot. But again, wind is a huge issue with that. And yeah, and you can do this again by taking a bunch of things. There are programs you could potentially combine those with.
Okay. And then do you use filters at all when you shoot?
I currently do not. When I first started, because right now I'm using a lot of point and shoot sort of things just because I want lighter cameras. But I used to use polarizing filters a lot, which will kind of give you darker sky, and it'll help you kind of control reflection on various things. Neutral density filter is something you can use. So I showed you that kind of waterfall-y flowing thing. So an issue there, you want a longer exposure. So essentially you need less light. So you need to shoot that picture when it's relatively dark, like as the sun's going down or something, or you can use a neutral density filter, which is essentially sunglasses for your camera. So it reduces the amount of light going in there. But there's a lot of different options or filters, but I don't use a whole lot anymore.
Great. Yeah, so people are saying that they've been using auto mode for years, and this is inspiring them to read their manual and try out what you've mentioned today, which is
good.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good just to see what you can do. And yeah, big thing to think about is go out and take a bunch of, like kind of showed you some of those comparison photos, take the same photo with these different settings and see what they do. Then you can compare them side by side and see what you like. And remember that each setting is going to be better for different situations. But knowing kind of what they'll do and get a feel for how it's done. And then once you know how to do it, then if you're in that situation, like, oh yeah, this is a situation I want this. Good to know about that ahead of time. But yeah, also just like flip to that menu and be like, oh my God, like it can do this. And yeah, one cool feature I cut out of the thing, but I'll say it now. There's something, I can't think of the name of it right now, but essentially where you can, it's more for action photos and stuff that I started using on insects, where you can essentially hold the shutter button down halfway and it's taking a bunch of photos while you're doing that. And then it's throwing them away. But when you press the button all the way down, it saves like the last 5 photos. So if you're trying to get something when it suddenly happens, your probably reflexes are going to be a little on the slow side. So by having it save those last 5 photos, you probably got whatever that action was that you were trying to get. So that was one that I learned about by watching a video on my camera.
Yeah. So kind of like a burst effect. Is that?
Kinda, except for it gives you the past because you're already recording what's going on.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so like if like for sports or whatever, somebody's going to kick that ball or whatever, you can get it, right as it's kicking potentially because you were too slow to hit that shutter speed.
Right. Yeah. And so does the point and shoot have a macro setting, or do you rely on f-stop for your close-up pictures?
So yeah, f-stop really has nothing to do with macro except for the problem that the closer you get to your image, the less depth of field you're going to have. But yeah, so on my cameras, I will always use the macro setting, or if I'm shooting without a point and shoot, I'll use a macro lens. But yeah, there's a macro setting on your camera. So if you're trying to focus close, definitely use that setting because it tells your camera that you're going to try to focus close, and then it'll be confused otherwise. And also worth noting is different cameras have different macro abilities. A lot of point and shoots have terrible macro. You just can't get that close. And again, this particular camera here, this is like the best one for macro I've found. The fact that you can get in ridiculously close. The big thing is with the point and shoot cameras, a lot of them do the macro at the widest zoom, so you're not zoomed in, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So by allowing you to focus close in when you're zoomed out zoomed in as close as possible, this camera really helps get you good macro.
Cool. So let's see, I think that's all of our questions so far. Do we have any last lingering questions? And so Keir, this is you use the point and shoot you mentioned because it's lighter, it's easier to kind of get out and take with you on your nature walks, right? Is that
Yeah.
the main?
Yeah, and I actually just got so this camera is more my macro camera, and I decided I wanted to do some bird photography, like, because that camera can't get in very close on things that are far away. So instead of getting a big camera with a bunch of different lenses that can go farther or closer, I just got another point and shoot that has a 40 times zoom on it. So now sometimes I carry two different point and shoots, which are still smaller and lighter than a big camera with a lot of lenses. Or I can just choose one or the other if I want to do a particular thing. But
Right.
yeah, you definitely sacrifice some image quality because the sensor sizes are much smaller. So you lose something there, but there's a lot to be said for having something that's light and portable and easy. So trade-offs.
Right. And so, okay, how do you make manual mode decisions and changes quickly to get good exposure without holding up your hiking buddies while you take 20 photos of a flower with different settings?
I usually take about 70 in program mode, but yeah, your buddies they'll have to deal with it. But yeah, manual mode is really a lot of times if you're going there, that's when you're playing around and you're really getting into the photography and just you want to take time and just play and see what will happen.
So maybe you need a photography buddy who will be just as
yeah, photography buddy is a good idea, or just go on your own.
Yeah.
The garden's a great place to go practice your photography.
Yeah, definitely. And so with photo composition, do you generally want subject matter in the center of the photo, left or right? What are your thoughts on that?
It varies. Whatever looks good to you. There's something called the rule of thirds, where you divide your things essentially kind of in thirds. So you maybe have something on the third on the left side or the right side, and you can do it this way too. But try to think about that. I don't know if that's something you definitely need to follow, but it can make for better photos. But really, every situation is different. Every photo is different. What you really want to emphasize is different. And the big thing I think is just take a variety. If you're not sure, try multiple things and see what you like. But again, what I was saying with the press the shutter down halfway. So say I want to focus on something here, then I can, if it's halfway down, I can shift it over here. So now that is in focus because I held it halfway down.
So it's kind of a matter of opinion, but the best way to figure it out is by trying, right?
Yeah, what makes you happy, but also what makes others happy. I will say, so I have a friend that wanted some prints of some of my photos, and she started looking through what I had in my on my hard drive and stuff, and she kept choosing everything that were the ones I screwed up on. So like I used to throw away all the bad photos, but I just kept them because I was just like, whatever. But yeah, everything that I thought was absolutely horrible, she was like, oh, that's the one. So it really is a matter of opinion, and there's different reasons why you may want something or else too. Like if you're going more artistic, or you're really just trying to have a diagnostic photo that's showing you particular features. So lots of options.
Right. All right. Well, is there any last questions? These have been great. It's been a nice way to kind of continue this conversation. So if you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. But while maybe some of you might be typing, I'll just let you know again that this is recorded. So if you want to go back and look at any of the example photos that Keir showed, like, or anything that you want to just rewatch, you'll be able to do that on the digital content page of the CalBG website, which is calbg.org. And I'll send a link to that page to you all in a follow-up email. And then you should have received the PDF of the summary of Keir's talk today, but if you didn't, just shoot me an email and I'll be sure to send that over to you. And yeah, I mean, this was really great, Keir. I think that everyone got a lot out of it, and seems like in the chat, people are ready to get out and go take some photos. Our friend Joshua Tree is going to go out and practice with her impatient husband. So that's great. Yeah, this is really wonderful. I think people feel inspired to try to look at their manuals and try new settings, which was the goal. So I encourage you all to get out today. It's a beautiful day. Come to the garden, go on a trail near your house, go to Joshua Tree and take some photos. So Keir, thank you so much for this. This was great.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Take care. Have a great day. Get out and take some photos. All right. Bye, everyone.